Picture this. It's roughly 1968.
Okay.
And we are in this really gritty working class neighborhood on the west side of Jacksonville, Florida.
Right, the real Deep South.
Exactly. So there is this 18-year-old kid named Ronnie Van Zant, and he flashes a fake ID and slips into this local dive bar known as the West Tavern.
Which, was a pretty typical weekend move back then.
Oh, absolutely. But out in the parking lot, sitting in a pickup truck, are his two younger bandmates, Gary Rossington and Alan Collins. They're just waiting in the truck. Meanwhile, inside, the music is loud, the air is just like thick with smoke and stale beer.
Classic dive bar atmosphere.
You know it.
Yeah.
And Ronnie is doing exactly what you do on a weekend. He is out on the floor, cutting the rug with a local girl named Linda Lou.
Just having a great time.
Everything is going great. The vibe is perfect until suddenly the front door swings open.
And the temperature in the room just instantly drops.
It really does, because in walks Linda Lou's boyfriend. And he is a large guy. He is highly intoxicated, and he is just radiating pure aggression.
Oh, man.
He scans the room, he spots Ronnie dancing with his girl, and he marches right over. And without a single word, he reaches into his jacket and pulls out a handgun.
Just right there on the dance floor.
Right there, he shoves it point blank into Ronnie's face. So suddenly, this 18-year-old kid is staring right down the barrel of a loaded weapon, surrounded by a crowd that has just gone dead silent.
I mean, it is the kind of terrifying, visceral moment where time just stops completely.
You're listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking. Today, we are taking a massive stack of musicological research, historical biographies, and archival studio session notes to unpack this exact moment in time.
It is such a fascinating story.
It really is, because we are exploring how a near-death bar fight not only birthed the Lynyrd Skynyrd standard, but how it completely flipped the script on that whole tough guy, Southern rock masculinity trope for like an entire generation of listeners.
We really do have a great roadmap for this discussion today.
Yeah.
The sources we're pulling from cover the entire journey of this track.
Where are we starting?
We are going to trace it from the sweaty, grueling rehearsals in a Florida swamp all the way into the pristine recording booth.
Oh, we're getting into the studio gear.
Oh, yeah. We're looking at the exact studio gear, the unique acoustic spaces, and the specific instruments used to capture this iconic 1973 track. It's really a master study in how a band takes a moment of sheer pants-wetting terror and engineers it into a cultural cornerstone.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the way Ronnie handles this guy with the gun is not, what you see in the movies.
No, not at all.
He does not try to be the action hero, does he?
Not even a little bit. Faced with imminent fatal violence, our sources show Ronnie relies entirely on rapid verbal bargaining.
So no throwing punches.
No physical bravado whatsoever, no posturing. He uses pure gallows humor. I mean, he actually looks at this armed, enraged man, sizes up the situation and says, if you're going to shoot me, it's going to be in the ass or the elbows.
That is just incredible.
Right. He literally just asks the guy for a head start toward the exit door.
Basically just, give me 3 steps and I'm gone.
Precisely. And miraculously it works.
Wow.
The gunman is momentarily distracted by the joke, and he turns his attention away from Ronnie just for a split second to yell at Linda Lou.
And that's all it takes.
That tiny fraction of a second, Ronnie bolts. He sprints for his absolute life, bursts through the heavy wooden doors at the tavern with the guy shouting right on his heels, and literally dives headfirst into the waiting truck with his bandmates.
And they just peel out into the dark night, tires squealing.
Exactly.
It is such an incredible cinematic escape. But, reading through our research for today, I kind of have to push back on something here.
Okay, what's that?
Well, Lynyrd Skynyrd really prided themselves on this gritty street realism, right? They were the band that wrote about the real, unvarnished, working-class world.
Right, that was their whole brand.
So why did they change the literal facts of the story when it came time to write the lyrics? Because, the song does not say West Tavern.
That is a really great observation, and it actually comes down to the fundamental mechanics of songwriting.
Okay, how so?
Well, you are right. The real venue where this went down was the West Tavern, which was actually later known as the Pastime Tavern. But in the song, Ronnie sets the scene at the Jug.
Which was a different place, right?
Yeah, it was a nod to another real local spot in Jacksonville called the Little Brown Jug. But why make the swap? Simply because the jug rhymes perfectly with the phrase cutting the rug.
Ah, I see. So the musical rhythm just flat out wins over the actual police report.
Exactly. You have to serve the song first.
What about the gun itself then? Because the song famously says he was staring down a .44. Was that an exaggeration too?
It was another lyrical liberty. Archival accounts from the band confirm that the real firearm pulled on Ronnie that night was actually a .38 Special.
Okay, so quite a bit smaller than a .44.
Right, but think about it from a songwriter's perspective. If you are trying to write a catchy, driving chorus, the word 44 provides this clean, hard, consonant rhyme with words like door and floor.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Yeah, the literal factual truth was slightly adjusted for the sake of the poetry, but the emotional core of the story, the panic, the bargaining, the desperate escape, that remained entirely factual.
So it is poetic license, but it does not change the heartbeat of the event itself.
Exactly.
And speaking of heartbeat, the adrenaline from that escape was obviously still pumping when they wrote the track, because they didn't wait like a week or a month to process what happened.
No, not at all.
That exact same night, riding the intense high of just surviving the West Tavern, the trio drove straight over to Alan Collins' house.
Right. They did not even go to sleep. They grabbed acoustic guitars right then and there in his living room.
Just immediately getting to work.
Yeah, fueled purely by the dark comedy of surviving and that leftover adrenaline spike, they hashed out the basic chord framework and the lyrics of Gimme Three Steps before the sun even came up.
But here is where it gets really interesting for me. A lot of bands might take that acoustic sketch, eventually wander into a recording studio and just, I don't know, jam it out until it sounds cool.
Sure, that was common back then.
But that was categorically not the Lynyrd Skynyrd way. The song was sparked in a living room, but our sources show it was truly forged in a place called the Hell House. What exactly was this place?
Oh, the Hell House is legendary in the annals of rock history. It was this small, tin-roofed, totally unair-conditioned shack.
That sounds awful already.
It was. It was located on a farm near Green Cove Springs, Florida. It was surrounded by dense woods, venomous snakes, alligators, and the absolutely blistering summer heat and humidity of the deep south.
Wait, a tin roof in Florida in the summer? That is not a rehearsal space. That is a slow cooker.
It really was an oven.
Why on earth would they choose to subject themselves to that environment? Why not just rent a garage with a box fan somewhere in town?
It was entirely about isolation and extreme discipline. You have to look at Ronnie Van Zant's background to understand it.
What about his background?
Well, his father was a prize fighter, and Ronnie absorbed that mentality completely. He treated the band's rehearsals exactly the way a boxer treats a grueling training camp.
Oh, wow. So it was highly regimented.
Extremely. We were talking about 8 to 10 hour days of relentless, exhausting repetition inside that shack. They did not just slap a capo on the neck of an acoustic guitar and casually strum around a campfire.
No, it was punishing work.
Exactly.
It honestly sounds less like a rock band practice and more like an elite military boot camp. But how did that specific brutal environment translate into the actual sound they produced? Like, what made them different from the other bands of that era?
What is so fascinating here is the stark musical contrast it created between them and their Southern rock peers.
Like who?
Well, if you look at a contemporary band like the Allman Brothers, their musical genius was largely rooted in loose, jazz-influenced jam sessions.
Right, those incredibly long, exploratory improvisations on stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Lynyrd Skynyrd operated on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Because of the crucible of the Hell House, they arranged every single note, every drum fill, and every vocal inflection with mechanical precision.
So no jamming out.
No improvisation was allowed whatsoever. Everything was completely locked in before they ever saw a stage.
So they were rehearsing 10 hours a day in this sweltering swamp. But sweating in a swamp does not automatically equal a platinum record.
True.
How did that brutal discipline actually translate when they finally got into a professional studio and, the expensive clock was ticking?
It translated perfectly, honestly. Let's jump ahead to March 29th, 1973. The band enters Studio One in Doraville, Georgia, to record their debut album. And they are working with producer Al Cooper, the man who had just signed them to his Sounds of the South label.
And according to the session notes in our research, Cooper was completely shocked by what happened next, wasn't he?
He was entirely stunned. I mean, Cooper was a highly experienced producer who had worked with massive established acts.
So he knew what he was doing.
Right. And he fully expected to have to heavily arrange and painstakingly produce this raw young band.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. He found he barely needed to change a single thing. They were so incredibly well rehearsed from their endless time at Hell House that they operated like well-oiled machines in the studio.
They just came in ready to go.
Yeah, they just plugged in and played it exactly as they had written it.
I really want to get into the actual musical DNA they captured that day, because Gimme Three Steps is hailed as the birth of what would become known as their three-guitar army.
It's a hugely important track for their sound.
The musicological research says the track is built in the key of D Mixolydian. Now, I know what a guitar is, but what does D Mixolydian actually mean for the listener sitting at home?
Is a great question. To put it simply, D Mixolydian is a music theory term for a specific scale that sounds incredibly bluesy and slightly unresolved.
Unresolved, like it keeps you waiting for something.
Exactly. It literally creates a psychological feeling of forward momentum in the listener's brain. It makes you feel like the song is constantly pushing ahead, making you want to move.
And they combine that scale with a driving boogie shuffle rhythm, right?
Yeah, a shuffle that clocks in at a brisk 134 beats per minute.
And it kicks off with that instantly recognizable biting riff. Let's talk about the specific guitars they use, because the tones are just so distinct.
That opening riff is Alan Collins on the lead guitar, and he's playing a Gibson Firebird.
Okay, so what does a Firebird do sonically that another guitar does not?
A Firebird produces a very biting, treble-heavy tone that cuts right through a dense musical mix. And in the studio, Al Cooper panned that guitar hard to the left channel.
Meaning what exactly?
That means if you are wearing headphones right now, Collins's guitar is entirely isolated in your left ear, which creates this incredibly wide, expansive live band feel.
Okay, so if the Firebird is screeching in my left ear, what is holding down the right side?
On the right side, you have Gary Rossington holding down the rhythm on a Gibson Les Paul.
And how is that different from the Firebird?
Well, unlike the Firebird, a Les Paul provides a thick, warm, bottom-end power. Rossington provides the low-end boogie rhythm, throwing in these warm chordal fills and bluesy bends that, perfectly balance out the aggressive treble of Collins' guitar.
But the secret weapon holding this whole thing together is the bass guitar.
Oh, absolutely.
Ed King was brought in to play the studio bass guitar for this session. The notes mention he played a melodic counterpoint. How does that actually work in a heavy rock song?
Ed King's contribution cannot be overstated. He provided what is essentially a walking boogie bass line. But because King was naturally a lead guitarist himself,
Oh, he was a lead player.
yeah, so he did not just play the simple root notes of the chords like a typical bass player might. He anticipated the guitar changes.
So he was kind of doing his own thing down there.
Exactly. He essentially wove a separate secondary melody entirely underneath the guitars. It acts as a melodic counterpoint that glues the entire complex track together.
It makes me think of a vintage V8 engine. You know, Rossington's rhythm guitar and the drums are the heavy iron chassis keeping the car on the road.
I love that analogy.
And Colin's lead guitar is the high-octane fuel, injecting these explosive bursts of speed. And then Ed King's bass line is the serpentine belt, connecting all those moving parts together so the whole thing does not just spin out of control and tear itself apart.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
But because they spent those agonizing 8 to 10-hour days in the Hell House, every single piston fires in perfect synchronization.
It really is a perfect analogy. And the studio itself provided some incredible unconventional sonic textures to wrap around that engine. Al Cooper utilized the very unique layout of Studio One to elevate the track.
Wait, I saw in the archival notes something about a septic tank.
You did.
Please tell me I misread that, because how on earth do you get a platinum vocal sound out of commercial plumbing?
You read that completely right, actually. Ronnie Van Zant's lead vocals were recorded using a very high-end Neumann U87 condenser microphone.
Okay, so nice mic.
A very nice mic. But to give his voice a unique, natural reverb, Cooper routed the vocal signal out of the control room and down into an actual empty underground septic tank chamber that sat beneath the studio facility.
Why would you ever do that?
It all comes down to physics. Because it was a massive, empty, concrete, subterranean chamber, the sound waves of Ronnie's voice bounced wildly and aggressively off the hard, cold walls before returning to the microphone.
Oh.
Yeah, it functioned as a natural echo chamber, creating this tight, gritty, authentic reverb that you simply could not get from dialing in a standard studio effect on a soundboard.
That is absolutely amazing. A multi-platinum vocal sound brought to you by an empty concrete hole in the ground.
It really is wild.
And they also brought in a session musician, Bobby Hall, to play bongos on the track, which seems pretty unusual for a heavy Southern rock song, doesn't it?
It does seem unusual, but it was a stroke of genius. Her bongos are panned slightly off-center in the mix.
What do they add to the sound?
Well, what her percussion work does is add this incredible bouncing human momentum to the rigid shuffle rhythm, working right alongside the heavy drum kit.
Giving it a bit of a groove.
Exactly. It keeps the song feeling light, swinging, and incredibly danceable, providing a brilliant contrast to the heavy, distorted rock guitar tones.
So if we step back, we have this mechanically precise, beautifully engineered, danceable boogie. But underneath that upbeat rhythm is a lyrical story that delivered a very unexpected and honestly highly subversive message for the early 1970s.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to look at the sociocultural context of post-Vietnam Jacksonville.
Set the scene for us.
This was a tough working-class environment dealing with severe economic tension and massive industrial layoffs.
A lot of stress in the air.
Exactly. The local dive bars, places just like the Pastime Tavern, were rough places. Violent escalations were not just a movie trope, they were a real, everyday hazard for the people living there.
And the typical rock and roll trope of that specific era, especially the Southern outlaw archetype that was so popular, demanded a very specific reaction to that kind of dangers.
Exactly. The prevailing cultural mythos dictated that a real man responds to a threat with physical dominance and unyielding courage.
Your whole tough guy persona.
Right. If a guy pulls a gun on you, the macho rock star script says you punch him in the jaw, or you pull your own weapon. You stand your ground, you defend your honor, no matter the odds.
But Ronnie flips that entire expectation completely upside down.
He completely subverts the masculine hero trope. Instead of posturing or puffing out his chest, he leans entirely into human vulnerability.
Which is pretty brave in its own right.
It really is. He openly sings into that microphone, "I was scared and fearing for my life. I was shaken like a leaf on a tree."
He abandons his pride entirely. He begs for his life. And the very second he gets a chance, he turns his back and runs away as fast as he can.
Just bolts out the door.
It is the ultimate anti-hero survival story.
And that is exactly why it resonated so deeply. It broke the facade.
Think about it for a second. Think about the last time you were genuinely, heart-poundingly terrified in your own life.
Probably a lot different than the movies.
Exactly. Your first instinct probably was not to puff out your chest and be a superhero. It was likely to bargain, to nervously crack a joke, or just to run away.
Just basic human survival.
That is exactly why this song hit listeners so hard back then, and why it still works today. It gave people permission to admit that they were human. It showed that true authenticity does not come from pretending you're bulletproof. It comes from admitting you're terrified. It just happened to be dressed up in an incredibly danceable boogie.
This raises a really important question about the song's lasting legacy, though. We talked about that rigid, brutal Hell House rehearsal method.
Oh, right, this sweltering swamp shack.
Yeah. Did that discipline actually hold up outside the controlled environment of a recording studio?
Did it?
The historical answer is definitively yes. Fast forward to July of 1976.
Okay, a few years later.
The band records their canonical live album, One More from the Road, at the massive Fox Theater in Atlanta.
And if you listen to that live recording...
the arrangement is virtually identical to the original studio version.
Even live.
Even live. Even with the chaotic energy of thousands of screaming fans, and even with the addition of Steve Gaines playing as a third guitarist on stage, the foundational architecture of the song simply does not waver.
That is wild.
The mechanical precision they learned in that sweltering Florida shack worked permanently. It proved that their musical discipline was just as real and unvarnished as their storytelling.
It is incredible how a single moment of absolute panic in a dive bar can echo for over half a century.
It really is.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over today as you go about your week. Think about how much of our cultural mythology, the classic songs we sing at the top of our lungs, the larger-than-life legends we build, the stories we pass down to our kids, is actually born from moments of absolute pants-wetting terror.
The stuff we'd rather forget in the moment.
Exactly. Moments that we only figure out how to laugh about long after we have safely survived them. What near miss in your own life could secretly be your platinum record?
That's a great question to leave on.
If you like this episode, please support the show by liking and subscribing.